The Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences is the broader focus is just on the science of both crime and how we construct criminal justice in a way that's both just and efficient.
A core part of ACJS that makes it a wonderful society to be a part of is it brings together research-focused practitioners alongside faculty and researchers out at universities and at think tanks, and that interfacing of the two. It's critical. It's central. I think the society does a lot of things to emphasize the rigor in research, but also the focus. So identifying core issues in criminal justice that are problems that are going to be front and center policy debates and dilemmas in the short and long term, to help set priorities for the field, and what should be researched and how to translate that research into policy and practice. That's the core mission.
A commitment from the Academy is the notion of research that's not disconnected from the world. It's just for science's sake, but it's aimed ultimately at ways in which you can inform and improve policy and practice. I think one of our challenges as editors for the journal, and I think challenges for the field, is having some kind of coherence behind the work that happens. So there's good and bad, for example, with the focus on COVID. So COVID was this huge phenomenon, and it led to a lot of researchers really laser-like focusing on different aspects of COVID and its impacts. But one of the challenging parts for the field, and I don't think it's just in crime and justice studies, is how do you unify that? What kind of patterns, what kind of longer term insights can we get besides just describing this phenomenon that's happened? It's almost equivalent of a vacation where you take so many pictures, it's hard to really know what to do with all of them. So on the one hand, it's really exciting for the field that there's so many things to study quickly, but also a challenge for the field is how do you rise up above all that in ways that substantially advance science rather than result in a lot of kind of brief snapshots of different things.
There's a trend in COVID studies, but also I think that has motivated lots of people to go back to some broader questions about communities and crime. And we're seeing work like that and works coming out in different journals. Another interesting challenge to go along with the one Dan identified is access to data is always getting better, and researchers are able to collect data faster. They're able to get data from agencies that over time have become better at collecting data. At least, the quality of data, it varies across agencies and criminal justice organizations, but they're collecting it. At the same time, it can sometimes be that the data accessibility is driving trends in research, less so the what questions are important. And so I think researchers, editors, reviewers, that creates a challenge for all of those different parties and players and collaborators in the research process, because by seeing what data we can get, we also see where there's a lot of glaring holes in criminal justice research. So we're not seeing much on jails. Jails are pretty critical. They're central to lots of policy debates, but jail data is really hard. And I think getting access to lots of data faster and better data reveals some important holes that hopefully researchers and policymakers can start pushing towards.
Despite lots of change in society around the world, there are timeless topics that continue to just be really important. The study of crime, new kinds of crimes like cybercrime, victimization of the elderly. It remains the case that studying sentencing is a recurring, constant focus, and one where there's a need for a lot more understanding. One example is the decision-making of prosecutors remains still pretty obscure. Most of the time with sentencing studies, people have court records data, but they don't really have access to the decision-making processes of prosecutors. So that's been a timeless problem, and it remains one. And it's So we have, alongside of a lot of new, we have timeless topics that still scholars are studying and will remain on the landscape. Taylor and Francis does a lot of operational support, helping us understand how to use the online system, which is really powerful in a lot of different ways. It can suggest reviewers sometimes, but the process for collecting the reviews, for making decisions, that's something that the Taylor and Francis actively supports us in, and is really very helpful.
There's also the production, the processing. That's really important for the journal to do well, to make sure that articles don't take too long to process, to make sure that communication coming from the journal, be it on our side as we help shepherd papers through the process, or on the production side, that the communication has been a really important thing for Dan and I as we've tried to install how we want to run the journal. But it would be a lot harder if we didn't have a good working relationship between ACJS and Taylor and Francis, and the Taylor and Francis folks being very willing to hold our hands when we need it as we learn those background processes.
I don't feel like an old person, but I'm old enough to remember paper copies being a big deal. Even sending papers out for review. Back in 2005, when I first got to Florida State, you were still sending papers out for review. You were sending paper copies to journals. And I think that had a significant hampering effect on, I think, the reach of journals. So I think for the Academy, it's a wonderful thing to have that international focus, and certainly our hope is that will absolutely help with the reach of the journal. Also, the submissions we get, which we do see, we get international submissions from all around the world.
We get to benefit from those experiences that Taylor and Francis has had with not just JQ but all the other journals. So when we've had conversations with Jackie and other people at Taylor and Francis, they're drawing on things they've seen, things that have worked well, things that haven't gone as well, and they're able to pass that on to us, and we try to do right by that information and implement it in our own practices.
The Academy has an annual conference. It's typically held in the United States, but it is international, so you get people from around the world. And they provide insights about so many different topics: lawmaking, new kinds of laws, the factors that have influenced the creation of new laws, who they're applied towards, what effects they have, policing, types of programs that are designed to promote safer communities, more just sentencing. It just goes on and on and on. So and public opinion is a big one. What factors shape public opinion, which is always a fascinating area, because the public sometimes is quite brilliant about understanding key things about crime and justice, but at the same time, oftentimes they are clueless about basic facts in crime and justice.
Perceptions about crime, about punishments for crimes, have always, they ebb and flow, as does crime and punishment trends. And the disconnect between the two is a really interesting gap to study. I talk to students or walk into my undergraduate class on the correction system or on criminology, and just you can do a quick straw poll and say how many people think crime's going up. And it's usually the majority do feel that way. And if you feel that trend plays out when crime's going down and when crime's going up. A cool thing about the meetings and the research that plays out at the meetings and then eventually in our journals, like JQ, is that it can try to first understand why perceptions don't always align with reality, and two, understand what the consequences of that are. And when you find that the consequences are pretty dire, right? When people perceive that they live in unsafe communities, even if they're not unsafe, that has consequences. The internet and news being on the internet and the internet becoming an echo chamber for people is a really interesting area of study in terms of what that means for how people perceive the world around them, especially when it pertains to crime and violence. So yeah, researchers have a really important role in doing good work around these questions. And ACJS and other organizations like it have an important role to play by bringing more and more policymakers into the fold to hear what researchers are doing. But researchers are good at research. They're not necessarily good at marketing or good funny tweets that gets people interested in the work they did. And I'm not sure they should be, but journals and societies are doing a lot of work to try to communicate science.
But there's lots of boring science that is important and interesting. And so how do you get that? That's one of the problems with the social media and a lot of news outlets is it's not a random selection of science. It's the stuff that's quirky, right? Rather than, or extreme. When Josh and I took over the reins, one of our emphases for the journal was big science. Now, the Academy is much bigger than the journal. The Academy does all sorts of things, including the annual meetings. But it does support Justice Quarterly, and it supported the proposal we put forward, which was to try to ensure that the journal really centered on and was the go-to place for big science. Now, we can define that different ways, but our focus was, are these articles that you could imagine someone reading 10 and 20 years from now? So we've had a lot of support from the Academy, from its executive board, and indirectly from Taylor and Francis to support a journal that's going to publish big science, because we think in the end that's going to be the best way to advance knowledge, to inform policy and practice.
We've really enjoyed and benefited from our conversations with Jackie and our other support folks at Taylor and Francis to think about processing, because there are so many journals and so much research flying around in the pre-publication process that there's a real reviewer fatigue. Reviewers are core to this. Journals that can't get good reviewers can't easily publish consistently good science. So we have benefited from the experiences of Jackie and worked really well with Taylor and Francis to try to construct a process that maximizes reviewer potential without, disproportionately contributing to reviewer fatigue. So that's important to us. It's also important, for authors, because they want quality reviews and they want them fast.